Hey, it's me again. I got my low budget explanation of your midterm questions right here. I'm going to pick up with question 15. So, for question 15, this is where you talk about your writers. Okay, so remember previously I said you don't have to worry about the writers with the reform, they belong in their own question. So, one thing I think you really should talk about again is kind of pulling in that War of 1812. That after the War of 1812, we see that nationalism really grow. And so, before the war, a lot of writers and artists are just sort of copying styles coming out of Europe. After the war, all of that changes. So, how can we pull that in? You bring in the Hudson River School, right? You talk about how we see nature and manifest destiny in those landscapes. Again, even better if you can get specific and say Asher Durand and Thomas Cole and any of these actual painters. But that's a great start there. Romanticism is another one you want to pull in as a uniquely American movement that's going to, I'm sorry, not uniquely American, but it's going to be a really important one. Transcendentalism is going to be the uniquely American part, where they're really encouraging people to rise above the corruption in their society. So we do see Romanticism also paralleling in European writing as well, and it encourages people to follow their emotions and their heart, kind of reject the logic of the Enlightenment. So some of our romantic writers over here are going to be Nathaniel Hawthorne, writing The Scarlet Letter. It's a great example. We're going to see that Edgar Allan Poe kind of has this new genre of horror that's kind of those dark romantics. And then the Transcendentalists fall under the umbrella of Romanticism, but they are specifically going to be about the corruption in society. And Emerson and Thoreau definitely write quite a bit about abolitionism and anti-slavery. So we're going to see that too. Education is another uniquely American thing in that we're going to see the call for public tax-supported schools, first coming out of Massachusetts with Horace Mann, making teacher training a little bit better, and at least the idea over here that an educated citizenry will lead to more democracy. So all of those are kind of showing these changes in art, literature, and education after the War of 1812. Okay? Let's look at number 16, the market revolution. So this one, I was surprised so many people said they didn't like this one. Again, I think you know what the market revolution is. I think you just forget that you know what it is. As soon as I talk about it, you'll be like, oh yeah. This one has a lot to do with the North-Southwest question. And you could also pull in a little bit of question 11 here, talking about how Marshall's Court rules in favor of businesses and kind of allowing large businesses to grow. And Justice Taney is going to continue this and encourage competition. So depending on the different sections, the market revolution is going to have sort of different effects. So the Southern cotton, the Western grain and food, and then the Northern factories are all part of this market revolution. So the market revolution includes transportation. Okay, so think canals, railroads, steamboats connecting the West. Transportation is going to be much more connected between the North and Northwest. Again, you can pull in Henry Clay. He's everywhere. Clay just won't go away. He's like the Napoleon of U.S. history, right? He's just all over the place. His American system connected the North and Northwest, but also left the South out, and they were going to feel kind of resentful by that. Cities are going to start to grow, and again, it's mostly in the north, but also the northwest along the rivers. Places like Cincinnati, Ohio, Wheeling, West Virginia, St. Louis, Missouri will start to grow too. Mass production with resources from different areas. So you've got more jobs. Ready-made clothing is a great example. And plantation owners in the South are extremely wealthy, but because those northern factories depend on southern cotton. So just kind of understand how the market revolution, transportation, the textiles, the growing factory system is involving every region, even though it appears to only affect the North, right? That's like saying that slavery was only influenced by the South. You guys, the United States of America was involved in the whole system of slavery, right? So that's what we want to understand and kind of point out with question 16. Okay, question 17. How do Southerners sort of demand their states' rights? So here's some good examples of some of those things that they're going to say. Your book calls free blacks the third race is what they were referred to because they had very little rights even in the North, right? There are about 250,000 of them in northern cities prior to the Civil War. So the Southern economy relies on cotton. A lot of these questions overlap. Do you notice that? That's okay, because a lot of U.S. history overlaps, right? The thread of slavery intertwines between all of our first 6 units. It's in every single unit. Hopefully you're realizing that. Other examples that Southerners are going to have to demand their so-called states' rights, they're going to use that Missouri Compromise. Okay, and the idea that 3630 is created seemed to validate slave owners' arguments and say, see, even the Supreme Court says we have these rights to our quote-unquote property. They're going to use biblical justification. They're going to cherry pick verses of the Bible that appear to say slavery is a wonderful thing, right? They're going to do that. The Ninth and 10th Amendment are sort of cherry picked out of the Constitution, which, remember, the Constitution was deliberately vague. So in some way, the framers did this to themselves. But those are good amendments that you could pull in their justification that, hey, we have the quote unquote right to do this in our state. But you're also going to notice that there is resistance. So I would pull in some stories of resistance, Nat Turner's Virginia Rebellion, Denmark Vesey's in South Carolina that doesn't actually happen. Both of those are extremely influential in terrifying Southern slave owners. And that's why we're going to see that in the 1830s and 40s, they're going to get even more, they're going to dig in, right? They're going to push even harder for their quote unquote right to own humans. And they're going to step up their slave codes, their black codes. They're going to continue to psychologically hurt people by dividing families and using any other kind of methods to terrorize the black population in the South, the enslaved people in the South. Amistad versus the U.S., you can pull that in. You could pull in the nullification crisis, which will sort of embolden the South to push even harder for states' rights. And then the biggie I think that's really important to pull in here is the gag resolutions that Congress actually says we're not going to allow any laws on abolition to even be discussed. And so that's something that we're really going to start to see. So they're getting more bold. John C. Calhoun would be a great person to pull in here. You don't pull in his creepy face. Sorry, John C. Calhoun, I'm just being honest. Pull in his ideas, though, because he writes South Carolina Exposition and Protest, where he's really outlining the whole states' rights philosophy that, of course, is going to lead us right up to Fort Sumter. Okay? Now, you didn't ask for 19, but I have it in here, and I was like, hey, bonus time. I'm going to go through 19 for you. Why not, right? How do we see the U.S. expansion into new markets increasing conflict? So we have a couple of questions that overlap the Mexican-American War. Your question on the Compromise of 1850, you've got to bring in the Mexican-American War there because that's what that compromise is solving. Here, I would at least kind of bring it in as the reason for expansion being seen as something that expands slavery. So I would talk a little bit about the role Texas plays there. You can even talk about Lincoln's spot resolutions, Thoreau's civil disobedience, which he writes because he gets thrown in jail, and then the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo up top. Haha, sorry. I love that video. We get a ton of land from Mexico. Really, we take half their country from them. But more land, more problems, right? Lots of arguing because 3630 will now not work anymore. So what we're going to see is the desire to expand into new markets. I would pull in Asia, I would pull in Central America, and I would pull in the talk of a canal. So for 19, that's what you want to focus on here, okay? Asian markets, you got to mention Commodore Perry's visits to Japan. I would also pull in some attempts to open up markets in China. That, of course, is going to increase the importance of California as being a major stepping off point for any trade related to Asia. We've got Central America. You definitely need to talk about Cuba. Okay, because there's a lot of talk in the Austin Manifesto of making Cuba a state, and of course it would be a slave state, right? Same thing with Nicaragua and William Walker. And for a lot of Northerners, they see that the South will stop at nothing to expand slavery. So it plays into that whole idea of the, quote, slave power that was growing in Congress. And then we've got our Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, where we're starting to talk about a canal, right? We don't get the Panama Canal for another 70 years, but we're starting to talk about it. We're working with England, and we're thinking of where it's going to go and what we want to do because we realize the importance of that as far as trade, and whoever can control that trade will be able to control the money. And you could even pull in the Gadsden Purchase as the example of how the Southerners are starting to push for more railroad connecting to California. So those are some of the things that you'd want to bring in for question 19. And with that, I've gone through a lot of your questions. So hopefully this helps. I know there's more. We will talk about them, but at least this is a start for the ones that tend to be the ones that people hate the most. So good luck. Don't forget to come in for some extra help.